Hello. That was a section from my orchestral work, Love Fire. It was from the third movement, Mystical Offering. And this is a mystical Weimar Sphinx, with the head of a human, the haunches of a lion, and the wings of a bird. It's supposed to be treacherous and merciless. Those who cannot answer its riddle are liable to be strangled and killed on the spot, and thereafter eaten by the ravenous monster.
Although actually, it's quite small, nothing like the Egyptian originals. And I've come here because I have a little riddle to unpack. I need to be like Oedipus when he approached the guarded entrance to Thebes, and the Sphinx demanded to know, which creature has one solo voice and yet changes from being 4-footed to 2-footed to 3-footed? Not wanting to be strangled and thereafter eaten on the spot, Oedipus cried aloud, "It is man because he crawls on all fours as a baby, then walks on 2 feet as an adult, and then uses a walking stick in old age."
In Egypt, we were accustomed, to rule for 1,000 years or so. And if you respect our location, we'll regulate the days of moon and sun. We'll sit in front of the pyramids to pass judgment on the nations, with changeless faces there amid war and peace and inundations.
I've come here because it's occurred to me that the greatest riddle from the perspective of Weimar culture and German culture in general is French culture, and no doubt vice versa. And, putting aside the tongue-in-cheek humour, I need to look briefly at a 20th century French tradition as a part of my narrative. I've already spoken about Poincaré in the context of scientific conventionalism, but I want to move to the next generation of thinkers, and the shift that was made to ethics by way of existentialism. I want to speak about 3 French figures who were born within just a couple of years of each other during the first decade of the 20th century, and who picked up on the work of Nietzsche and Heidegger in their various different ways, and whose work was reintegrated into the idealist tradition later in the century, and who will therefore form a part of my look at the role of the identity thesis in modern social theory. In this episode, I want to look very briefly at the work of Olivier Messiaen, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Immanuel Levinas, and explore their approaches to existentialism and ethics, which in turn has had an impact upon post-Adorno critical theory, and thereafter my own opera, Iphigenia in Weimar.
I could say a great deal about the work of Olivier Messiaen, whose music I've loved for many years. I remember poring over many of his scores and his theoretical work, Technique de mon langage musical, as a young man, even before I went to music college. I could say the Goethe Park is a lovely place to consider his work given the delightful birdsong. But I want to talk about one of his pieces in particular now, his late opera, St. Francis of Assisi.
Messiaen was a devout Catholic and drawn to Christian mysticism. When asked to write an opera in his 3-footed walking stick years, at first he considered dramatising the Passion, the mystery of the crucifixion, the meaning of the blood of Christ in the Eucharist, and the significance of the voluntary sacrifice. But eventually he came to feel the subject was simply too potent for him to handle successfully. Instead he chose to dramatise the life of St. Francis of Assisi, which paralleled that of the Christ. The structure of the opera focuses on Francis' spiritual development and the progress of his soul towards grace. The first act encompasses the realisation of spiritual goals, including a scene entitled The Cross. The second act tells of Francis' passage towards spiritual enlightenment, including his religious ministry, including a scene entitled The Sermon to the Birds. The third and final act reveals the saint's immersion in eternity, including a scene entitled Death and the New Life. I could talk about the lush string harmonies, or the bird-like woodwind gestures, or the juxtaposition of hymn-like chorales and contrapuntal passages, or the striking use of unison, or the complete absence of thematic development. But actually, I saw the opera performed by the Bavarian State Opera about 5 years ago, conducted by Kent Nagano and directed by Hermann Nitsch. The orchestral music was rapturous, as is always the case with Messiaen, and the performance was inspiring. However, the theatrics were dismal. And in fact, this is why I've chosen to look at this piece in particular. To emphasise Messiaen's religious imagery, the cross and in particular the notion of redemptive sacrifice, there was a lot of blood. It wasn't so much the frequent crucifixions, the pots of red paint poured over white canvas, that made it so repulsive. It was the huge video screen eclipsing the stage, dwarfing the singers and the music and the whole notion of an opera, repeating a section of video over and over and over again of butchers in an abattoir, their hands at least, massaging the bloody entrails hanging out of a cow carcass. On and on it went. Forget the music. Forget Messiaen's own conviction to veracity and conscience. This was a case of clutching fame by notoriety, and to hell with the sensitivities of aesthetic norms. Having said that, I have some sympathy for the director's objectives, even if to my taste he handled the realisation of that objective poorly, to the debt of the music and the opera, and the vision behind the opera. The mystical element of the crucifixion, beyond the mechanistic quality of the doctrine, A therefore B, God sends his Son for self-sacrifice, therefore redemption for humanity, is compelling. But what does the symbolism of blood refer to? What does it mean not only in terms of soteriology, but in terms of existential ontology? What is the notion of sacrifice not only in religious dogma, but in the Iphigenia myth?
Take as many tripods as you think you'll need, and as many vessels as sacrifice requires to fulfill the customs of the sacred rites. Take cauldrons and basins and circular bowls, the purest of water from the holy fountains in deep urns. Take care that you've dry wood too, such as will quickly catch fire and hold all ready. And finally, don't forget a well-honed knife.
Evolutionary biology tells of how frequently animals of different species sacrifice their own fitness, that's to say their ability to breed and pass on their genes to the next generation. There are monkeys yelling out to warn their communities of danger and thus putting themselves in danger. Or there are birds choosing to aid other birds' nests at the expense of establishing their own. And there are many human narratives of sacrifice for the sake of others too, especially of parents for their children. But the St. Francis myth reaches deeper than this, as does the Iphigenia myth. It asks what it is about human virtue, with its hopes and aspirations, its compulsions and desires, that reveals the essence of existence, the nature of death, and the would-be abyss of non-existence.
I'd love to look at other French musicians, notably Boulez, who died only very recently. I'd love to look at his contemporaries Foucault and Derrida, but I suppose these figures will have to wait for another inquiry. If I'm going to look at Sartre, I should probably also look at his Parisian contemporaries, at the writings of feminist theorist Simone de Beauvoir, and at Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, published 2 years after Sartre's Being and Nothingness. But, well, the batteries on my video camera are limited after all.
But I should take the time to emphasise that the reason I'm looking at influential French figures at all in this inquiry into the heritage of Weimar thinking is because the National Socialist period in Germany and then the aftermath of the Second World War caused the main narrative represented by the Weimar identity thesis to disperse over a wide geographical region. The emergence of modern music in Western Germany in the late 1940s and 50s, and in particular the central position of Darmstadt composers, indicates a rapid reintegration into the European mainstream. But the scope of culture was very restricted. There was no room for discussion of phenomenological or existential matters. While the German economic miracle progressed, writing remained private and moralistic. Even in the 1960s, when there were revolts against the establishment in France and other Western countries, in Germany it was the avoidance of a confrontation of the past that generated ire. Robert Holub stated, German activists of the 60s were concerned not only about the reinstallation of traditional values by their elders, but also about the avoidance of a thoroughgoing and candid confrontation with Nazism and the Holocaust. And even this was watered down in Weimar and the German Democratic Republic. The West was committed to freedom of speech and pluralism, at least in principle, but the East was subjugated. Anything not overtly anti-fascist or anti-capitalist or staunchly pro-communist was censored. The only sentiment permitted was a celebration of triumph. So bear with me if my narrative might get a little diffuse. Sartre was one of the key figures in the traditions of phenomenology and existentialism, reaching back beyond Nietzsche both to the young Hegelians and their addition of social discourse to the work of Hegel, and to the most mysterious works of Schelling and Kierkegaard and Ludwig Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, his peek at how the social characteristic of humanity projects as infinite power in realms of beyond the world. However, Sartre was not interested in being, or even reflective consciousness, levels 1 and 2 of my mind map. He was occupied exclusively with mental processes. Sartre said that just as the intentional mind can create mental images of external objects, so it can also create mental images of the absence or the irreality of objects. This sense of representing nothingness as a concrete entity can occur by way of non-existentials, such as dragons or vampires. Absent existentials, such as when a loud person in a room excuses themselves, for instance to visit the bathroom, and their absence from the room is noticeable. And by way of indeterminate existentials, such as ghosts or the notion of flying pigs, when the subject is not sure whether to believe something as present or absent, or possible or impossible. Sartre said this negation is not a deductive or rational process of thought, such as the use of a syllogism, and nor is it a qualitative judgment, an aesthetic judgment. Instead, it's an attitude that exists prior to judgment. The nothing is perceived phenomenologically as a something. An awareness of absence that follows a person leaving the room is an experience of non-being. He says this is an intentional act of an imaginary irrealization and reveals a process of intentional acts. Sartre argued that the power of the imagination to represent the vacuity of nothingness as an object of being reveals the essential freedom of consciousness. However, this freedom is brought under duress by way of the material context. Most people merely act out pre-established social roles that they perceive as representing their identity. They conform to social expectations and value systems without really considering the alternative. But according to Sartre, humanity can break free of these constraints. People can reach for an authentic existence whereby they might live freely according to personal choices. Adrian Chaplin wrote, "For Sartre, the imaginative power to negate the present is a prerequisite for free consciousness. In order to think the world other than it is, consciousness must become free from the constraints of the world."
However, if a person is able to emancipate themselves from these constraints, then there is immense responsibility. It's no longer meaningful to blame others or the material context. It's a freedom that offers unconstrained ethical and political potential, and that in turn entails sacrifice. Echoing the sentiments of Messiaen, Sartre argues that it reveals an essence of existence that is the equivalent of the nature of death.
What does this mean in terms of human virtue? How should we lead our lives? In response to Sartre's work, Volker Hager asked, "Should we hope for a better world in the distant future at the price of accepting state terror? The revolutionary mass politics espoused by Sartre in the name of Marxism would seem to contain this trade-off." Sartre located great value in art forms that privileged direct articulation of the ideas of freedom, such as literature and poetry. These are able to support the notion of authentic existence, whereas, according to Sartre, music is more likely to lead to lethargy by way of contemplative states created by sensory aesthetics.
Nevertheless, even literature pales in comparison to inter-subjectivity, the fusion in the world of the dimensions of self, others, and nature. Sartre said that inter-subjectivity is not an objective system to be described and analysed from a third-person perspective. Rather, it lies in the relations that exist between subjects. Its full characterisation is only possible by means of the first-person perspective.
Sartre said the ultimate form of intersubjectivity comes by way of the encounter and confrontation with a radical otherness, which brings me to the third figure on my list. Sartre and Levinas both rejected Merleau-Ponty's elimination of the difference between the self and others. But in the case of Levinas, who developed his ideas as a student of Husserl and Heidegger at the University of Freiburg in the late 1920s, this commitment was grounded by both the phenomenological and scientific traditions. He embraced the introspective methodologies outlined by the phenomenologists pertaining to qualitative states. Yet he also endorsed empirical knowledge as far as it can be determined, without embracing the absolutism of realism. In his book Totality in Infinity, which was written the same year that I was born, Levinas tied matters of phenomenology to a naturalised approach to the ethics of inter-subjectivity. He identified a problem that arises in any kind of absolutist approach, even absolute relativism, the subordination of the other to the same, whereby the other is other people, and the same is everything else of physical and spiritual and phenomenal and functional existence. Levinas argued against this reduction, against the necessity of any totality encompassing all reality. He argued that there was always a face of the other, the people met in the home or on the street, irreducible to any totality. He said that there can only ever be one absolute, and that is the absolute ethical responsibility to the other. He said that this is the sole case of necessity which is given to people by way of existence, the demand of an unconditional respect and responsibility. Alfonso Lingis wrote, Levinas elaborates the existence of the I as a being for others, responsible for others, responsible for the very irresponsibility of others. Levinas said metaphysics itself is made subservient to the ethical imperative of the other. He said each person makes an unconditional ethical mandate which declares, do not hurt me. It is not the utilitarian threat in use by the force of law, if you hurt me society will reprimand you, and neither is it a deontological standard, hurting is immoral, don't do it. Gary Gutting said of this principle, it is simply an assertion of the inviolability of this person before me, of my absolute responsibility to respect this person's presence. For Levinas, the locus of mind is not to be found in intentional consciousness, nor the question of being, but in ethics. It's the stature of the other person that comes first, to the point of a possible dying for the other. Although actually, Levinas says death angst is greater for another than the self, due to the responsibility one has for the other. This is not a being towards death as described by Heidegger, but an imperative to prevent the pain and suffering, and finally the death of the other. It follows that knowledge does not exist for its own sake, and learning does not exist merely for the sake of the learner. The very purpose and meaning of learning and knowledge, of aesthetics and music, is justice, integrity and democracy, caring for the sick, feeding the hungry, and providing shelter for refugees. In the programme note for the last movement of my Third Symphony, I wrote, a consciousness of self, coupled with an awareness of another possessing the same attributes of mindfulness as the self, discloses heteronomy and humility, and a responsibility for the other. It is a bond of duty that prescribes a yielding to the other, a capitulation to service. It beseeches love and devotion, but also self-abnegation. It confers integrity and virtue, but also fervour no less than that of a millennial summer of adoration. Just as there shall be conviction and courage, so there shall also be singing and dancing, the gentle and the euphoric, and sublime symphonies. There shall be moral strength to show commitment to a tomorrow unseen by the self, even to the extent, taken to the extreme, of self-sacrifice, and a willingness to renounce life for the sake of the other.
I'd like to finish with another section from my orchestral work Love Fire, which deals with matters of sacrificial symbolism. This is a passage from the fourth movement, Hoisting Aloft.